Plants dying, pets sick, soil turning black. It wasn't nature, it was sabotage. My neighbor was poisoning everything I loved, and when I set a trap, the truth about who was helping her shocked me even more. I always thought my garden was the safest place in the world. It was where I went after long days to unwind among the roses and lavender, where I could feel life buzzing in every corner, the bees floating lazily, the hummingbirds darting, the smell of mint brushing against my hand every time I reached for the watering can. But last spring, something began to change. At first, it was the roses. I woke up one morning to find their petals browned and curled as if fire had kissed them. I blamed myself. Maybe I'd watered them too much or too little. Maybe the soil needed something extra. I sprinkled fertilizer, tried pruning, but within a week, the entire row looked like it had been scorched. Then came the herbs. My basil collapsed in a single night. The thyme shriveled, the parsley gone in 2 days. It didn't make sense. I checked for bugs, dug through the soil for grubs or beetles, found nothing but an acrid smell that clung to my gloves. Even after I washed them, I didn't want to admit it, but the thought crept into my mind, something unnatural was happening. The final straw was Daisy, my little spaniel puppy. One evening, she bounded into the yard chasing butterflies. By the next morning, she was lying listless in her bed, her breathing shallow. The vet said it looked like she had ingested something toxic. I felt a cold panic spread through me. Was my yard poisoning everything I loved? That night, I stood at the kitchen window staring into the moonlit yard. The silence felt wrong, too heavy, too still. My once lively garden was becoming a graveyard, and the guilt sat heavy in my chest. I told myself I would figure it out. I wouldn't lose another thing to this invisible plague. The next morning, I knelt by the wilted roses and pressed my hand to the soil. It felt damp, colder than it should have, and again that faint chemical smell, sharp, bitter like cleaning fluid. But why would that be in my garden? I tried to push the fear aside, but when I walked past my neighbor Carol's yard, I couldn't help noticing how green her plants looked. Perfect roses, perfect lilies, not a single leaf out of place. She smiled at me, waved cheerfully, said something about how gardening takes a special touch. I forced a smile back, but deep inside unease coiled tighter. Maybe it was jealousy. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was nothing at all. But that night when I checked on Daisy, I swore I heard a noise outside. A faint slosh followed by footsteps retreating into the darkness. I pressed my face to the window, heart hammering, but saw only shadows. That was the first night I realized the answer might not lie in my soil at all. If your plants and even your pet suddenly started dying, would you think it's nature, or would you start suspecting someone nearby? Sleep didn't come easily after that night. I kept hearing the sound over and over in my head. The faint slosh, the almost rhythmic footsteps fading toward the fence. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe a raccoon, maybe someone walking their dog, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel the wrongness of it. So the next night I made a decision. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, pulled up a chair by the back window and waited. My garden lay still in the moonlight, a patchwork of pale silver shadows. The wilted herbs limp in their pots, the roses already stripped of color. I sat there listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional bark in the distance. Hours passed. Nothing moved. The shadows didn't shift. I began to think I was imagining it. Maybe I was letting grief and guilt play tricks on me. Daisy stirred in her bed and I leaned down to check her breathing. She was getting stronger. The vet had given me medicine and I swore to protect her from now on. Then around 2 a.m, I heard it again, a faint splash followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the soil. My pulse leapt into my throat. I killed the lamp by my chair and pressed myself against the glass. The figure came from the side yard, moving slow, deliberate, a hood pulled over their head. They carried a jug in one hand, tilted it and poured something at the base of my flower bed. My stomach twisted when I saw the liquid glinting faintly in the moonlight, thick, dark, soaking quickly into the soil. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run outside and demand what they were doing, but fear pinned me in place. What if they had something dangerous? What if they turned on me? Instead, I crouched lower, watching every movement. The figure moved methodically, pouring in 3 separate spots, then turned and slipped back toward the fence. I leaned forward and saw the faint outline of their profile, the sharp jaw, the short hair, the walk so familiar it made me freeze. Carol, my neighbor, my smiling perfect rose's neighbor. I stayed at the window long after she was gone, heart pounding harder than it had in years. My thoughts raced. Why would she do this? What did I ever do to her? Why target me, my garden, my puppy? The next morning I went outside to check. The soil where she poured was blackened already, the leaves of the nearest bush curling inward. I knelt down and scooped some into a jar. The smell was chemical, harsh enough to sting my nose. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't disease. Someone was trying to destroy my life, and I finally knew who. If you caught your neighbors sneaking into your yard at night, would you confront them immediately or quietly collect proof first? I couldn't shake the image of Carol moving silently through my garden, with that jug in her hand, the casual way she poured poison into the soil, as if it was just another chore. The same woman who waved at me every morning across the fence, chatting about weather and recipes while secretly destroying everything I loved. But now that I knew I had a choice, confront her and risk her denying it. Or worse, turning the situation against me or gather proof that no one could ignore. I chose the second. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store pretending I was there for new soil and gloves. But what I really picked up was a small outdoor camera, one of those motion-activated models that blend in with the garden. I also bought an extra set of solar lights so no one would suspect why I was fiddling with the flower beds. When I got home, I set the camera inside a birdhouse, angled perfectly toward the spot where Carol had poured from her jug. It felt sneaky wrong even, but I told myself I had no choice. I needed to see it again with my own eyes recorded. That night, I sat at the window again, coffee in hand, Daisy asleep beside me. For hours, nothing happened, the garden still under the weight of moonlight. I began to think maybe she wouldn't come, maybe she knew I was watching. But just after 2, the camera light blinked faintly and there she was again. She moved slower this time, carrying the same jug, her hood up again. I watched as she crouched by the hydrangeas, poured steadily, then glanced around as though expecting someone to catch her. I held my breath, afraid she'd sense me watching, but she didn't. Her face tilted just enough for the moonlight to reveal her features. There was no mistaking her Carol. The next morning, I checked the footage. My hands shook as I replayed it over and over, Carol clearly visible, pouring liquid onto my plants. No excuses, no denial possible. I finally had proof. But my victory felt hollow because the question that haunted me was why? Why would Carol do this? She had a beautiful, thriving yard. She had no reason to envy mine, and we'd never had an argument serious enough to spark this kind of malice. Later that day, I tested the soil in a little plastic kit I found at the garden center. The reading came back toxic, way beyond anything safe. My stomach twisted at the thought of Daisy breathing it in, walking across the grass. I felt rage rising like I'd never felt before. This wasn't just my garden anymore. This was my dog, my home, my safety. That night as I lay in bed, I promised myself I wouldn't just watch silently again. I would find out the truth about Carol, and I would stop her before she killed anything else. If you had video proof of your neighbor poisoning your garden, would you go straight to the police or confront them face to face first? I woke the next morning with my mind made up, the video footage still fresh on my laptop. The sight of Carol crouched among my hydrangeas, pouring poison, like some gardener of death replaying in my head. Over and over, I couldn't eat. I couldn't think about anything else. I needed to face her, so I waited until I saw her out front, pruning her roses. She was dressed in her usual pastel sweater, hair tucked neatly behind her ears, smiling as though she didn't have a secret in the world. I walked over, my pulse racing so hard I thought I'd faint before I even reached her fence. "Carol," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." She looked up pleasantly. "Of course, dear, about what?" I pulled out my phone, opened the video, and held it up. She froze, the smile slipping from her lips as the screen showed her crouched in my yard, pouring from the jug, the evidence undeniable. For a moment, her eyes flickered wide and then narrowed into something hard, sharp. "I don't know what you think you're proving," she said, her voice lower than usual. "People edit things all the time." My heart pounded. "Don't lie, Carol. I watched you. I smelled the chemicals. You nearly killed Daisy." At the mention of my puppy, something flashed across her face, a twitch in her jaw, her lips pressed tight. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she snipped another rose with deliberate calm, as though she needed the sound of the clippers to drown me out. Finally, she said, "You don't understand. Not everything is about you." Her words rattled me. "What does that mean?" "Carol, why would you do this?" She turned to face me fully, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes things need to be controlled. Gardens can get out of hand. Weeds, pests, you never know what spreads." "That's not true," I snapped. "You poisoned my flowers on purpose. You poured chemicals into my soil on purpose. Don't try to twist this." Carol's eyes flicked toward the houses down the street, then back to me. "If you're smart, you'll drop this. You don't want to make enemies here." The warning in her voice sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't apologizing. She was threatening. I stepped back, gripping my phone tighter. "I'm not afraid of you. I have proof, and I'm not going to stop until people know what you did." Her smile returned, but it was different this time, colder. "Suit yourself, dear, but remember, gardens aren't the only things that can be poisoned." I walked away, trembling, fury and fear tangled together in my chest. I had proof, but now I also knew Carol wasn't just a jealous neighbor. She was dangerous. That night, I locked every door, every window, and sat awake with Daisy curled against me, replaying her words over and over. Gardens aren't the only things that can be poisoned. If your neighbor warned you to drop it after catching them red-handed, would you back off or push forward no matter the risk? The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The jar of soil I'd collected from the poisoned flower bed was smashed in the middle of my porch glass, scattered across the welcome mat. I knew I hadn't left it there, which meant someone had come onto my property in the middle of the night again this time, not just to kill plants, but to send a message. I swept the shards with shaking hands, wondering if Carol had been watching me from her window as I discovered her little gift. The thought made my skin crawl. For the next few days, things only got worse. My mailbox was stuffed with torn gardening magazines, my trash can overturned more than once. My once peaceful street suddenly felt hostile. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside set me on edge. Daisy barked constantly at the back fence, ears pricked as though she could sense someone lurking. I began to wonder if Carol was trying to rattle me into silence, if she wanted me to lose sleep, to wear me down until I gave up and let her have her way. But the truth was, every small act only strengthened my resolve. I couldn't let her win. I owed Daisy, I owed my garden, and I owed myself. So I decided to go to the police. I brought the video and the toxic soil sample I'd managed to collect before the jar was smashed. The officer who met me listened carefully, his brow furrowing as I explained everything he promised. They'd look into it, but warned me to be careful. "Sometimes people escalate when they know they've been caught," he said. His words echoed in my mind that night as I lay awake, listening to Daisy breathing softly beside me. My phone buzzed once just past midnight, an unknown number, a single message: "Keep digging and see what happens." My blood ran cold. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark, the thread as clear as day. I wanted to believe it wasn't her, but who else could it be? The next morning, I noticed something strange in Carol's yard. Her roses, which had always looked perfect, had begun to droop, just slightly, not poisoned, not dead, but weakened. And that's when I realized she wasn't just targeting me. She was experimenting. She was testing different chemicals, different doses, and she'd perfected her method on her own garden first. The horror of it sank into me like ice. She had built this poisoner's craft over time, fine-tuned it like some twisted science project, and now she had turned her focus onto mine. That evening, I bought a stronger camera, one with night vision. I set it higher in the oak tree at the edge of the yard, aimed to cover both my beds and the fence line. If Carol thought her warnings would silence me, she was wrong. I was more determined than ever to catch her in the act again. this time with enough evidence to bury her. But what I didn't know was that Carol had her own plans for me and I was already a step behind. If you started receiving threats after going to the police, would you double down like the protagonist or back off to protect yourself? By the time the weekend rolled around, I'd barely slept. My nerves stretched thin from the constant threats and the memory of Carol's cold smile, but fear had slowly hardened into something sharper determination. I refused to let her win. I refused to keep living in dread of what she might do next. So I decided it was time to set a trap one she couldn't squirm out of. This time, I wasn't just going to catch her on video. I was going to catch her in person. I started with a yard. I sprinkled harmless flour around the edges of my flower beds, thin enough to be invisible in the dark, but clear enough to record footprints. If someone stepped across it, I also placed one of Daisy's chew toys near the center of the lawn, a decoy, something for Carol to notice if she wandered too far from the flower beds. I wanted to see how bold she'd become. Next, I set my new night vision camera in the oak tree, angled perfectly at the backyard, and connected to my phone so I could watch in real time. I also pulled Daisy's bed into the living room, closer to the window so she wouldn't be exposed if chemicals were poured again. She curled up by my feet, as if sensing the tension. By midnight, the house was silent. My only company, the faint hum of the fridge and the steady feed from the camera on my phone. I sat curled on the couch, lights off blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, my eyes fixed on the screen. 1 o'clock, nothing. 2 o'clock, nothing. At 2:30, my eyelids began to droop, and then a flicker on the screen snapped me awake. Movement at the fence line. A shadow slipped into view, careful, deliberate. My heart raced as I recognized the familiar hood, the familiar posture Carol. She crouched by the hydrangeas again, the jug in her hand. I watched her pour the liquid into the soil the way she always did, but this time she lingered too long, her eyes flicking upward, scanning the yard. She must have noticed something different. Maybe the placement of the lights, maybe the faint glint of the camera, I didn't know. And then she did something that made my blood run cold. She stepped farther into my yard, her gaze fixed not on the flower beds but on the back of my house, on the very window where I sat frozen. I held my breath, willing myself not to move, as she stared directly toward me for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she turned back, poured once more, then slipped to the fence and disappeared into the shadows. I exhaled shakily, but my phone buzzed with a recording notification. I had her this time, in full clear night vision. No denying, no editing possible, but my relief was short-lived because when I stepped outside to inspect the flower, I saw something that chilled me even more. There were 2 sets of footprints, Carol's leading from the fence to the flowers and back again, and another set smaller, lighter, leading only one way toward my basement door. If you found evidence that more than one person was sneaking into your yard at night, would you stay and investigate further, or move out immediately? The moment I saw those footprints, my stomach dropped. I knelt down with my flashlight, the flower dust glowing faintly where it had been disturbed, 2 distinct trails clear as day. Carol's heavy, deliberate prints circling my flower beds and another set, smaller, narrower, leading toward my basement door and never coming back out. I felt Daisy tug at her leash behind me, whining low in her throat, ears pricked toward the house. She sensed it too. Someone else had been here, not just in my yard, but maybe inside my home. I bolted back inside, slammed the lock on the basement door, and pressed my ear against it. My heart pounded so loud I almost convinced myself I could hear movement on the other side, a faint shuffle, or maybe just my imagination. I didn't dare open it. The next morning, I reviewed the camera footage over and over. Carol was clear, visible as always, but at one point when she turned her head toward the house, I caught something in the corner of the screen, another shadow lingering near the fence line, smaller, shorter, watching. It wasn't just Carol. That thought followed me all day as I watered what little was left of my garden, careful to avoid the poisoned patches. The idea of her working with someone else made my skin crawl. Why? What reason could anyone have to team up for something like this? By afternoon, my nerves had worn thin, so I decided to test something. I placed another small camera inside the basement near the door, angled low just in case. Then I sprinkled flour across the floorboards, too light to be seen at night. That evening, I sat on the couch with Daisy curled up beside me, watching the feed as usual. Around 1 a.m, the now familiar figure appeared, Carol moving like clockwork, pouring poison into the soil. And then it happened on the basement camera, a faint creak of hinges, then the flicker of movement. Someone slipping quietly through the door. They were smaller than Carol, slimmer, moving faster, wearing a hood too. But the camera caught enough, a pair of gloved hands pulling at the boxes I'd stacked near the wall like they were searching for something. My breath froze in my chest. I wanted to scream, to call the police right then, but I stayed silent, watching as the figure moved through the basement, carefully, deliberately, before slipping back out and closing the door behind them. When I checked the basement later, the flower was disturbed, clear footprints, smaller than Carol's, but adult-sized. Someone had been inside my house while I sat just 1 floor above, completely unaware. Fear mixed with fury inside me. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. This was my home, my sanctuary, and now strangers were slipping into it like it belonged to them. Carol wasn't working alone. She was just the face of something bigger, and I was in far more danger than I realized. If you discovered someone had been sneaking into your basement at night, would you try to catch them yourself or call the police immediately? By the next morning, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the next intrusion. I needed answers, proof, not just of Carol, but of this second figure who had the nerve to walk through my basement like they owned it. My fear was still there, but it had hardened into something more dangerous, curiosity mixed with anger. I started small. I dug through the basement looking for anything out of place. Then I noticed the corner where I stored old gardening supplies. One of the boxes was shifted an inch forward as though someone had pulled it out and shoved it back in a hurry. I opened it, and my stomach twisted. Inside were my gardening gloves and bottles of safe plant food, but one of the bottles had been swapped. The label looked right, but the cap was loose when I sniffed it. The chemical sting made my eyes water. They were planting evidence in my home. I sat back on the cold floor, hands shaking. If Carol or whoever was working with her wanted to frame me, this was how they'd do it. Slip poison into my supplies and wait until the police or animal control came asking questions. My heart hammered so loud I could hear it echo off the concrete. I grabbed my phone, called the detective who had taken my report before. He listened carefully, promised to send someone out to check the bottle, but warned me again that without catching someone in the act, charges might not stick. I thanked him anyway, then set the bottle aside like it was a live grenade. The rest of the day I watched Carol from my window. She moved around her yard, calmly pruning watering, humming to herself like the perfect suburban neighbor. But now every glance, every smile felt rehearsed like a mask hiding something darker. I noticed something else too. A young man came to her house mid-afternoon, tall, lean, carrying a backpack. He stayed only 10 minutes before leaving through the side gate. I'd never seen him before, but something about his build. His stride matched the figure from my basement camera. The second intruder wasn't random. He was connected to Carol. That evening, I decided to push further. I looked up Carol online, searching property records, old news articles, anything that might explain her behavior. What I found shocked me. 2 years ago, she had been fined by the county for using illegal pesticides on her roses. She'd nearly killed an entire hive of bees belonging to another neighbor. The case had been buried quietly, but it told me this wasn't new. She had a history of poison, and now maybe she had a partner, someone younger to help her carry it out. I leaned back from my laptop, shivering despite the warm room. My garden wasn't just under attack, it was the battlefield of something much bigger. If I wanted to stop them, I had to act before they turned all their attention from my plants to me. If you discovered your neighbor had a past history of poisoning, would you confront them with that knowledge or keep it quiet while you gathered more proof? By now, my fear had transformed into focus. The bottle in my basement, the camera footage, the shadowy accomplice, everything pointed to something bigger than one neighbor feud. Carol wasn't careless, she was calculating, and if I wanted justice, I needed to be just as careful. I sat at the kitchen table with Daisy curled against my leg, scribbling notes like a detective. Names, dates, what I'd seen, what I'd heard, the smell of chemicals on the soil, the midnight footsteps, the young man with the backpack, every detail mattered. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to record them, I was going to catch them together. I bought a second set of motion cameras this time, with audio, and placed them not only by the garden, but also inside the basement and near the side gate where the accomplice had slipped out. I even wired a small hidden mic under the eaves facing Carol's yard. It wasn't legal evidence maybe, but I needed to know the truth. The waiting was the hardest. My nerves were stretched thin. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound outside made me jolt. But finally, 3 nights later, movement pinged on my phone screen. It was Carol again, hood up, jug in hand. She crept into my garden, pouring slowly along the fence line. Then just minutes later, the second figure appeared. The same tall, lean shape from before. He carried a backpack again. I tapped the audio feed. Heart racing. I heard Carol's voice, low but sharp. Make sure you don't spill in the wrong place. We don't need her catching on too soon. The young man answered, his voice younger, more nervous. You said she'd stop planning after the puppy got sick. Why are we still doing this? Because, Carol hissed, people like her don't deserve to win. She flaunts that garden like it's perfect. She thinks she can outshine me. Well, she can't. It hit me then. This wasn't about me personally, it was envy. Carol's perfect roses weren't enough, so she decided to destroy anything that might rival them. And the boy helping her, he wasn't just an accomplice. He sounded reluctant, trapped, maybe pressured. I kept recording, my hands trembling. Carol directed him to sprinkle something near the back hedge while she moved toward Daisy's play area. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed them both fully exposed. I needed undeniable proof. When they finally left, I replayed the audio 3 times. My proof was there, her voice, his voice, the instructions, the motive. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was confession. I sent the files straight to the detective along with the video footage. He responded within the hour, promising a visit in the morning to collect everything officially. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of relief. But it was short-lived because, as I leaned back in my chair, Daisy started barking not at the door, not at the window, but at the basement stairs. And when I listened closely, I thought I heard the faintest creak of a floorboard below. If you caught your neighbor and their helper red-handed, would you call the police immediately? Or confront them yourself to stop them once and for all? The sound in the basement froze me to the spot. My first thought was that Carol and her helper had come back. My second was that maybe I had finally pushed too far. My proof was already with the detective, but if they caught me now, it wouldn't matter. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and Daisy stayed close by, growling low. I eased the basement door open and stepped onto the creaky stairs. My light cut through the dark beams bouncing off the stone walls. At first, nothing. Then movement. A shadow near the far corner. Don't move! I snapped, voice trembling but firm. The beam landed on him, the young man from before, backpack slung over one shoulder. He raised his hands quickly. Wait, please, I'm not here to hurt you, my pulse thundered. Then why are you sneaking into my house again? His eyes darted toward the floor, then back to me. I didn't want to do this, she made me. She's my aunt. I live with her. She said if I didn't help, she'd kick me out. I just wanted to stop her. Something about his voice cracked with honesty. His fear didn't feel staged. Still, I kept the flashlight steady. What's in the bag? Slowly, he set it down, unzipped it. Inside were more containers, bottles with labels peeled off, the same poison I'd found before. My stomach nodded. I was going to leave it here, he admitted. She told me it would frame you. That way no one would believe you. Even if you complained, I swear I didn't want to. I came tonight because I thought maybe you'd catch me and it would all end. Before I could respond, a sharp knock rattled the basement door, followed by a familiar voice dripping with false sweetness. You awake down there, neighbor? Carol Daisy barked furiously. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, adrenaline flooding me. The boy looked pale, terrified. If she knows I'm here, she'll... But I was done hiding. I marched up the stairs and threw open the door. Carol stood on my porch, jug in her hand, smile frozen when she saw me behind the glass storm door. I know what you've been doing, I said, voice steady. I have the video, the audio, and a witness right here. The police have it all, Carol. It's over. Her face twisted like a mask cracking. You think anyone will believe you? They'll laugh. You're just some pathetic gardener with a mutt. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed across her yard. The detective had arrived faster than I imagined. Carol's words cut off her jaw dropping as two officers stepped out. I opened the door wide and gestured, ask her yourself. The boy stepped forward from behind me, head bowed. She made me help. She said no one could prove it. Carol lunged as if to snatch the bag from him, but the officers were faster. They pulled her back, her protests, shrill breaking against the night air. My legs nearly gave out, but relief steadied me as they led her away. Later, the detective assured me the evidence was airtight. The chemicals matched the damage in my soil. The recordings were clear. Carol would face charges not just for property damage, but for animal endangerment too. Standing in my garden under the dawn light, I looked at the battered soil, at the fragile new leaves, already pushing through. I felt hope for the first time in months. Daisy wagged her tail beside me. Alive, strong, loyal Carol's roses might still stand across the fence, but she no longer had the power to poison mine. If your neighbor was caught sabotaging your life out of jealousy, would you ever forgive them? Or is betrayal like that unforgivable?